Welcome, everybody. Welcome. Come into our Co-opting AI Zoom room. It is so good to see you. Hi, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of Co-opting AI. I'm excited to see you. I'm excited for this conversation. I'm Mona Sloane. I'm an assistant professor of data science and media studies at the University of Virginia. I'm a social scientist, and I study the social embeddedness of artificial intelligence systems. I am the convener of the Co-opting AI series. I work with a wonderful team at the Digital Technology for Democracy Lab at UVA and the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU. Very grateful for their terrific support. I am extremely excited for today's conversation because today we will be looking way back into the past to a time, and I just learned this. This is the sort of formal definition to a time before the period that we call the Middle Ages. Today, we will be talking about antiquity. So we tend to think about AI as a sort of quasi-natural phenomenon that sort of just happens to us. That is inevitable. It's a hugely disruptive technology. It's always sort of in the horizon. And when we try to wrap our heads around that, we often focus on the technical aspects of these systems, the mathy math, if you will. But I would actually argue that culture, a collective imagination, narratives around automation, intelligence, um, machines, gods, all of these scaffold how we think about and enact not just technology and sort of innovation, but what a future can look like. And this is indeed an ancient practice. Ancient myths, such as the Greek stories of Talos or Pandora, or the automatons created by Hephaestus, serve as some of humanity's earliest explorations of AI and perhaps human hubris. These ideas prefigure modern conceptions of robotics and artificial intelligence systems, and they do not only depict technological dreams and anxieties, but also pose ethical questions and point to enduring concerns about the power and agency that is embedded in these ideas and the actual technologies. So I think that means that looking at our brave new world of AI through the lens of antiquity could potentially help us better understand how past narratives and practices continue to this day, how they shape how we think about AI, about automations, about the divine, and what kind of language we use. So I am delighted to be joined today by three experts who know how to do exactly that. Please join me in welcoming my guests today, Jacqueline Arthur-Montagne, Kevin Donnelly, and Ellie Truitt. Beginning today will be Jacqueline, who is the John L. Nell III Assistant Professor of Classics and a member of the Faculty Advisory Committee to the Democracy Initiative here at UVA. She's a faculty colleague. She received her Ph.D. in classics from Stanford in 2016. Her work focuses on the educational practices and intellectual culture of ancient Greece and how institutions of schooling in antiquity shaped the legacy of classical Greece to the present. She has published many articles on Greek literature and cultural history. For example, in Classical Philology and Greek, Roman, and Byzantine Studies. She has co-edited a volume on Documentality, New Approaches to Written Documents in Imperial Life and Literature. And she has a book in progress called An Education in Fiction, which argues that literate education in antiquity rigorously trained students to discern fact from fiction and written and oral narratives. And the AI folks among you will hear AI themes all over this. So welcome, Jacqueline. Following Jacqueline today will be Kevin Donnelly, who is an associate professor of history and teaches a wide range of courses in European and world history at both the Serbian and the Seminole level. He is interested in the history of science and intellectual history, broadly conceived. He's interested in modern European ideas, including notions of progress, technology, and the sciences of men. Again, hugely important for conversations around AI. He has also published a lot, articles and book chapters. He researches the 19th century polymath Adolphe Quetelet, very important figure. He also works in the early history of climate change, boredom in science, and many other topics. He has published a book on artificial intelligence called The Descent of Artificial Intelligence, a deep history of an idea 400 years in the making with the University of Pittsburgh Press. And closing us out today, and now here with us in the room is Ellie Truitt. Welcome, Ellie. She is an associate professor in the Department of History and Sociology of Science at the University of Pennsylvania. She studies the circulation of scientific objects and natural knowledge throughout Central and Western Eurasia and North Africa from antiquity into the early modern period. She's particularly interested in how scientific ideas, practices, and objects traveled and were adapted to new settings and philosophical treatises, archival materials, literary texts, lyric material objects, and images. All of these inform her work. She also has written a book. It is called Medieval Robots, Mechanism, Magic, Nature, and Art, out with Pen Press, which explored the history of automata in medieval Latin culture, where they appeared as gifts from foreign rulers in Baghdad and Damascus, and at the courts of Constantinople and Chengdu. Her research has been supported by the NSF, by the Mellon Foundation, Huntington Library, Max Planck, many other places. She has also many, many articles out, and she also works on the concepts of AI in the Middle Ages. I am so psyched for this conversation today. Thank you all for joining. Little bit of housekeeping as per usual. We will hear provocations from our panelists today, and I have the privilege of engaging in a conversation with them around that. You, the audience, are encouraged to put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom right of your Zoom screen, and we will fold them into the conversation. And with that, I am going to be quiet and hand the virtual mic over to Jacqueline. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides if that works for everyone. Let's see if I can pull it off without uploading my whole desktop. There we go. Okay, I think. Oh, okay, bear with me 1 second. Sorry, it looks like this Zoom has some privacy settings. Yikes. Sorry about that, guys. Okay, there we go. I think I did the trick. And okay, sorry, technical woes today.
No worries at
Okay,
all.
there we go. I think I got it. Okay, great. Can everyone see?
Yes, we're
Okay,
here.
perfect. There we go. My techne. I feel like that, the classicist is on par for for having some fun technology. So first of all, thank you so much for having me at this discussion. I'm really looking forward to learning about my fellow panelists' works and to Mona for organizing. As the beautiful introduction emphasized, my work mostly lies in the realm of ancient education and intellectual culture. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about how that applies or ties into ancient intelligence, artifice, and techne in the classical world. Let me ask before I start this upper panel. Let me see if are other people able to see it. Maybe I'll go ahead and hide the floating panel. There we go. Okay, I think, can anyone still see me pretty well, Mona? Is that still
Perfect.
visible? Good.
Looks
Okay,
wonderful.
great. Okay. Um, So, in my time today, I'm going to emphasize just three concepts that I think can help us think through the relationship between antiquity and modern artificial intelligence. And they are the notion of divine origins of technology. I'll be curious to see if that's also true in the medieval period. The second is human skepticism and the artificial when it comes to intelligence and automation. And then lastly, the role of enslaved labor and the idea of an enslaved human library or enslaved archive of intelligence. So I will offer no big conclusions, but some food for thought to think with, and we can go from there. Okay, so to begin, I think Mona indicated this, but it might be delightful for folks to know that the very first description of sort of automated entities or artificially intelligent entities pops up in our very first epic poem of the Western tradition, and that's Homer's Iliad. In Iliad 18, Homer describes to us how Hephaestus, the god of the craft and the forge, is helped by these attendants who are described. He has these attendants who are, I'll read a little bit of the passage. They're golden in appearance. They look like young women. Maybe no surprise that our very first automatons have to be aesthetically appealing. But what's really important to the poet is the qualities that these automated beings have. They have intelligence, nous. They have voices and speech that simulates human speech. And from the immortal gods, as Homer tells us, they have learned how to do things, erga isasin. So the divine as described as both the sort of creation entity, but also the simulating entity, that it's due to the divine that these female robot-like figures have the ability to do things and say things that are meaningful to their human counterparts. Mona also indicated another automaton named Talus, also described in our Apollonius Hellenistic Greek poetry, this huge being made out of bronze who circles the island of Crete. And I think the metallic aspect is interesting because metal, of course, it's very visual appealing. It also gives the perception of it being invulnerable, really powerful and strong. So, what is the relationship between the aesthetic interface and the human user or collaborator? But just as these sort of beautiful young women attendants are able to help Hephaestus, perhaps the other best known sort of automated or artificial figure is the character of Pandora, the first woman who represents all the gifts that the gods have to give to human beings. I love this depiction of Pandora on this calyx, this crater, this red figure, because you can see as I zoom in, even the way she's standing, she looks a little bit artificial. Now, according to Hesiod, just like the attendants of Hephaestus, Pandora is really aesthetically appealing. Athena, as he describes, gives her ornaments. The graces and persuasion give her golden jewelry and flowers. So, really decorated, meant to draw in the eye and the user. But what's sort of hidden away from the human men who will receive Pandora is the fact that she's also a pretty deadly artifice. Hermes, the messenger god, has put lies into her, pseudeia, and also this thievish character, epiklopon, this sort of sneakiness. And in totality, what it is that Pandora embodies is dolos, the concept of deception. So even here in our very first Greek depictions of these sort of artificially constructed automated beings from the gods, we already have the red warning signs about artificial intelligence or automation being deceptive and deceptively dangerous to humankind, which I think is really striking for our conversation. I now want to turn a little bit to this sense of human beings testing or trying to disprove the artificial in technology. I suspect most of us probably know the mythology of Daedalus. Daedalus is a sort of early Greek mythological figure. He's immortal, but he's a mortal man, but he has been endowed by the gods with godlike crafting abilities, right? He produces the labyrinth on Crete. And in these depictions, we see him creating the famous wings that both he and his son Icarus will use to fly away from Crete. The wings are a real representation of the way in which the divine, the natural, and the human come together in artifice. Because, of course, Daedalus is a man, but he's using his God-given talents to create a techne, craft. But he's also taking his inspiration from the natural world, from birds' wings. And so both God and nature are the inspiration for the artificial in this scene. So I think most of us sadly probably know how this myth goes. Daedalus and Icarus have a few brief moments of happy flight, but Icarus flies too close to the sun, the wax on his wings melts, and he comes tumbling down as a sort of living embodiment of the perils of hubris, of aspiring to too much as a figure. But one of the anecdotes I found really striking when reading Adrienne Mayer's fantastic book on gods and robots is that there's actual evidence from antiquity of, of people, Greek speakers in later historical periods, performatively testing out this technology in order to sort of prove its failure, to prove its impossibility. So this is an anecdote from the ancient geographer Strabo, who describes how on the island of Lefkada, there's this annual ritual sacrifice in which the people select a criminal to be flung from the high cliffs of their island. And before they do this to this poor criminal, they strap wings onto him and birds of all kind. Of course, every time they do this, there's a sort of reenactment of the potentiality that he might fly, but of course he doesn't. And as this passage describes, when the ritual ends and he falls to his death, off the cliffs and into the sea, the local fishermen gather him up to transport him beyond the borders of the city. He's a source of pollution and of danger. And for that reason, as a sort of quasi-artificially failed technological being, his body must be taken outside the bounds of the community. I want to close by touching on my last point, which I think might speak to how we think about the costs or the burdens of artificial intelligence even into the present day. And that this is much more closely related to my work on ancient education, memorization, and literacy. And it's the ways in which we see enslaved laborers being used as enslaved archives, as sort of living data centers or living repositories for information that slave owners want to have close at hand, but don't want to have to internalize all for themselves. In the Roman Empire, as we hear more and more about formal education and the leading intellectuals, we see stories like this one in which wealthy figures are purchasing or training slaves to serve as, again, enslaved archives. In this story from a 3rd century author named Philostratus, we hear about a leading rhetorician named Herodes, whose son Atticus appears to have some form of dyslexia. He's bad at his letters, he's not good at memorizing. And the way that Herodes will tackle this is to purchase and raise 24 slave boys, and each of them will receive a name that matches a letter of the alphabet, so that as Herodes' son gets older, he will interact with these boys and learn the alphabet through these living enslaved beings. And practicing them by necessity, as Philostratus says, he will practice the letters of the alphabet. It's kind of a shocking imagining of how one might have enough wealth to purchase and raise enslaved children, but also the question of what happens to these enslaved young men when they're no longer of value to the owner. Much of what we know about the history of enslaved peoples in antiquity tells us that enslaved children do not fare well after their use has been discarded with. So human lives are really being used and then quickly discarded for the purpose of an artificially encapsulated intelligence. Perhaps even more striking is another anecdote from Seneca the Younger, another author of the early Roman Empire, who talks about someone who got rich quick, a certain Calvisius Sabinus, who did not have the time or the talents to actually learn the great books himself. So, what he does is he purchases slaves, he says, and each slave is supposed to memorize a different major Greek author by heart, right? So, one has to know Homer, another Hesiod, and he delegates one slave for each of the lyric poets. And at the end of this sort of shocking anecdote, what we learn is that Sabinus uses his enslaved archive the way we might use a smartphone or ChatGPT. When he's hanging out with his friends, he keeps these slaves close at the foot of his couch and he asks them for verses that he might repeat, right? Just kind of summoning information and data storage from the enslaved archive at will. And I think anecdotes like these, of course, they're very much embedded in their ancient context, but they do make us think about the human costs of what it means to create and sustain artificial intelligence. I will close here and just emphasize these three core themes. I'm really excited to hear how my fellow panelists might diverge or where we converge in our views on antiquity and artificial intelligence. Thanks so much.
Thank you so very much, Jacqueline. There's so much AI in here. Incredible. Wonderful. Kevin, let's hear from you. You're muted.
I will share my screen and all right, how does that look? Are you able to see it? I'll get back to Kane. Sorry. There we go. How does that look?
Perfect.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for asking me to be part of this, Mona. I like the idea of a provocation very much. The first time I became familiar with your work happened to be at the 2018 conference in Cologne on the computational social sciences. And this was a presentation, or this was a conference mostly of statisticians, computer scientists, and quantitative social scientists who were all trying to combat bias and disinformation in the world of algorithmic products. And I believe your title of your talk at that was called Ethics is a Smokescreen, and basically said that it was impossible to do what everybody else at the was trying to say they should be doing. I kind of had a similar level of provocation at that conference as a historian. Especially of people who had done research into quantitative social science and data for a long time. I was attempting to try and tell that audience that much of what was happening in the computational social sciences had been happening for about 400 years, had mostly failed, and that most of the people are unaware. So what I'd like to do today, I think kind of fits in with that a little bit, and I will try to tie it into Antiquity, even though the book that I just wrote does not quite go back 4,000 years. It only goes back 400 years, but I think I found a way to kind of tie in some of the themes from the book to Antiquity. So the title of the book here that you can see is called The Descent of Artificial Intelligence, A Deep History of an Idea 400 Years in the Making. And the book was essentially designed as a way to tell the history of how we've thought about people rather than as a history of machines or certainly thoughts about the mind. It was essentially designed to tell us what is the human level that artificial intelligence has been trying to attempt to get to for quite some time. And one of the things that struck me as I was a history of data science and quantitative social science was that nobody was really asking the question of what was meant by the human level. And so I came upon this book in 2018. Those of you that know it, probably everybody in this room knows all the names on there. This was a set of interviews. And one of the things that they did was they asked each one of the people that you see there, when will artificial intelligence achieve the human level? And what was kind of notable is everybody answered, and Martin Ford, a good statistician that he was, kind of averaged it out and even gave standard deviations, and I think it was something like 31.3 years or something. And I was struck by this because as a someone in the humanities department, I thought, do they know what the human level is? And so I searched throughout the whole book, and nowhere in this book was there any definition of what the human level was or should be. And that struck me, of course, because people, and sure, Jacqueline and Ellie know this even better than I do. People have been searching for what exactly is a person, or how do you describe what a person has done. And this takes place a lot in the current discourse. You see here again names that I don't have to explain to people in this room. Jan LeCun basically talking about Sam Altman's determination of when the human level will be met, I don't know, 6 years, 9 years, back and forth. But again, no definition of what is meant by human level. And I thought this was great. If you kind of dig a little bit deeper into the chat, you'll see this one commenter say, well, what kind of person are you talking about? And is this Cooter at the gas station? Are we talking about Einstein here? What do you actually mean by human level? And I think it's interesting that the response is essentially it's a punt. It just says, well, we don't have to worry about human level. We're not even at a cat yet. But it sort of punts on the fundamental question of what artificial intelligence is trying to accomplish if we don't have a definition of what the human level is. And of course, I think as most historians and humanists would agree, I don't know that we have a great definition. I thought even more uh, provocatively, Werner Herzog, the director, just released this great film where he interviewed neuroscientists, and I think he asked like 25 neuroscientists what a thought was, and not a single one of them was able to really define exactly what a thought was. So I've always been struck as someone who's studied the long history of social scientific attempts to understand human actions, the level of certitude that at the time it was the computational sciences, but now it has kind of taken over in artificial intelligence. The sort of certitude of the very thing that is supposed to be met by artificial intelligence is hardly ever defined. I'll just give one more example, which particularly drew my ire. This is from Alex Pentland, who is at the MIT lab. I don't know if he's still there. I think he's still at MIT. But he wrote a book called Social Physics, and the subtitle is Lessons from a New Science. And it wasn't a new science. Social physics as a science had been named and coined by Adolphe Quetelet about 250 years earlier as physique sociale, and I was quite familiar with that. And so I could go on and on with these examples of sort of, I guess you could call sort of historical illiteracy. And it brings me to this great Keynes quote, which I kind of previewed. It's one of my favorite quotes, that is, practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. I would probably update that to something. This is not a quote. There's no quote marks on this, which is a lot of tech people who believe themselves to be exempt from intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct social scientist. So that, in a nutshell, is the book. And I wanted to just kind of to give you the outlines of what happens in the book before I kind of dive into the more specific element of antiquity. And the way that I'm going to kind of smuggle antiquity into my story, I had proposed a larger work. I don't know if I was going to go back 4,000 years, but I had proposed a larger work that went back before the scientific revolution. And as these things go, it doesn't, you got to kind of cut the book off somewhere. And so what I wanted to do was talk about one group I talk about in the book, which is a group of 19th century, what you might call counter-revolution or anti-enlightenment folks in France. They go under this great sobriquet of the prophets of the past, because they were essentially, I think today they would probably be called paleo-conservatives. They wanted to end divorce. They wanted to, they wanted to end divorce. They wanted to reinstate slavery in some cases. They were basically the most anti-enlightenment kind of people that you can imagine, and they basically wanted to sort of drag the sciences and drag social science kind of back to the age of antiquity. And what I found striking about them as I read them, and most of their kind of political views would be odious to most everybody here, but what struck me was how much they also sounded like a lot of embittered liberal arts professors in universities, because of their discussion of how science and people were learning after the French Revolution. So I wanted to just give you a couple examples from one figure, Louis de Bonald. And he complained in particular that the people were only speaking in social scientific language, that caused the spirit to act against itself, to wither, to be consumed by mute abstraction of the soul. And you can see some of the other quotes there. What was no most notable about Bonald was that he saw intelligence itself as social. He did not think you could have kind of a deracinated individual intelligence. It had to be embedded in a social context. And you can see he described the descent of humanity from the authentic to the inauthentic, and that intelligence itself and society will fall into artificiality. And what really struck me when I was reading this, and I wanted to explore in the book, which is, again, I'm happy I was able to get a chance to do this, is that I think there's a very definite difference between intelligence in the ancient world and intelligence in the modern world. And I think we have experts here who can probably speak directly to that. What really struck me, what I wanted to do was kind of do a little bit of a spin off of Benjamin Constant's work on the liberty of the ancients and the moderns. And for those of you who in this room don't know that, essentially what Constant said was that the ancients had a form of liberty that relied on servitude. It kind of ties in with what Jacqueline said before, and that liberty and freedom could only be expressed in the collective and within the group, and that modern liberty was essentially much more individual, deracinated, but also had sort of good fortune in that it didn't rely on the subjugation of others to come about. And so what I think would have been an interesting way to, what I'd like to kind of talk about or maybe kind of get in here is what if you wrote something like on the intelligence of the ancients and the moderns? Because I think what Bonald and a lot of these prophets of the past were saying was that you cannot have an individual intelligence. Intelligence itself has to be bound up in the collective. It has to be bound up in society. It has to be bound up in some sort of larger group. And of course, for AI today, our AI is very, very much drawn as a deracinated individual, completely separate from society vision of intelligence. And one of the things that I kind of try to take through in the book is how that intelligence has been born, in the last 400 years. So not only do we not know the human level, no one has really been able to come upon a definition of the human level, but I would argue that we're actually using a very modern, very specific, very Western version of intelligence, and one that doesn't capture the full history and the full scope of what intelligence has meant. And so that's one of the reasons I thought this would work well with some experts in the medieval and age of antiquity. Because I think I'm right in saying that just the very concept of intelligence, and especially how it's applied in artificial intelligence today, is a very modern vision of intelligence, and really wouldn't make sense to many of the people of the past. If you think about kind of the things that we ask intelligences to do today, would they answer the most important questions? Say people from the medieval age, would you be able to answer the question of how best to save my soul? Would that be a question that an artificial intelligence could help? Going back even further, I think it becomes more difficult. So I wanted to just kind of briefly kind of trace those ideas, throw a couple ideas out there, and then hopefully maybe in the discussion or the chat, we can have a little bit of overlap in time. So I went through my, 11 slides in just about the right amount of time there. I didn't have my clock going, but hopefully I was able to stick to the 8 to 10 minutes. So much appreciated, Mona. Thank you, Jacqueline. Look forward to hearing what you have to say, Ellie. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kevin. All right. Much food for thought, especially, as a social scientist and somebody who's quite committed to the liberal arts. I have more questions, but Ellie, Dr. Truitt, welcome. Please close us out.
Thank you. Let me just, everyone see my screen? Great. Thank you so much, Mona, for this invitation, and thank you to my co-panelists, Kevin and Jacqueline, for these fascinating presentations and provocations. So Mona asked us to offer a provocation to anchor our short presentations, and I'm going to offer three. So the first, as Jacqueline has already made clear, is that AI is not new. Despite the language of technological innovation and cutting edge technology that we so often hear, intelligent machines have been thought about, imagined, and attempted for a very long time. Now, as Kevin says, and I think he's right, there is a difference in terms of thinking about what intelligence means. So I think for the ancient and medieval periods, it makes perhaps more sense to think about a spectrum of AI from, say, augmented human intelligence to something more like the sentient machines that Jacqueline discussed that were Hephaestus's kind of handmaids. And even after sort of in the sort of Hellenistic period, you start to see um, attempts to actually build all kinds of really elaborate mechanical devices powered by hydraulics and pneumatics, including sort of musical automata, programmable fountains, and a lot of other kinds of sort of related objects. And you see them also starting to be incorporated into pageantry. So one of the things that I think we see in this like ancient period and that has kind of is that they've been with us for a long time. They're often they lack autonomy in whatever guise or context they appear, and they're always kind of servile. Now, the second provocation that I want to offer is that AI in the past was used for a lot of the same things that it's used for today. So the sort of Hellenistic automaton making technologies that were really kind of established and worked out in Alexandria eventually were taken up and improved and expanded by engineers in the Islamic world. And in the Islamic world, you see a lot of different kinds of automata. Again, programmable fountains, you see really elaborate water clocks, musical instruments, you see mechanical animals, birds, etc. And then also mechanical servants. And you see them installed in palaces and adjacent to mosques. So highly socialized, ritualized spaces. And these aren't only, we see them in sort of fantastical fictional literature, but we actually see them also designed and built. And so here we see four examples from Al-Jazari's Compendium on the Theory and Useful Practice of the Mechanical Arts from the turn of the 13th century of the Common Era. And the first two are complex water clocks that have a lot of different, what we would now call complications, and that have, for example, you see on one a zodiac dial. You see different kind of levels of sound create technology to sound the hours and different um, intervals as well. And then the other two are mechanical wine servants or cupbearers, and they're intended to sort of serve sherbet or wine or sort of rose water, perhaps. Now, these objects are really interesting in that the accompanying text not only refers to these servants, which are actually described as slaves, but also the human servants that are essentially the technicians that keep them running. So these are objects that would be kind of in a sort of semi-public, sort of elite court space and have their own kind of human attendants or technicians to keep them going. And this, I think, shows that these objects are absolutely intended to communicate the power and authority of the ruler. In this case, the message, one of them, is that even my slaves have servants. So that there are kind of multiple types of servants and people under the control of the caliph or the emir. Now, in the Latin Christian West, these objects actually remained largely confined to fantasy and fiction. They weren't actually built until around the turn of the 14th century. Nevertheless, we see in these imaginative contexts a lot about the sort of technological imaginary of AI. And one of the things we see them doing a lot is policing people and boundaries. So we see these kinds of artificial sort of metal people, whether it's golden or copper archers, knights, pikemen, etc., being installed or encountered at the entrances to castles, guarding bridges, guarding tombs, for example. The middle and right hand images here are from two different sort of historical romances. The middle one is from the story of Lancelot, so sort of fictionalized history, essentially. And these are two copper knights that he finds guarding an enchanted castle. And then the next image is from history. It's attached to Alexander the Great and the idea that he encountered these two golden enchanted figures guarding a bridge that went to an enchanted forest, and he defeated them. They were both armed with hammers. Um, Now, we see also a lot of instances in which the guarding is perhaps not only physical, but somewhat social as well. So, in an account linked to the story of Lancelot, but in this case, the story of a different knight of the Round Table, Percival, but also from the early 13th century, there's a tournament in which one of the knights has guarding his tent two figures, two AIs. One has a spear and it bars the way from anyone who tries to enter who's not of noble birth. And then the other one is a musical figure. And if a woman tries to enter who's not a virgin, the figure makes a really discordant, loud noise on the harp that it's holding, and its strings break. So in this case, these figures are actually policing not only a physical boundary, the entrance into the tent, but they are maintaining social distinctions as well. And we also have an example of another type of AI that ends up kind of monitoring women's sexual morality, which is the mouth of truth or the bocca della verità, which is the image on the left. Was attributed to Virgil, who had the reputation in this period as a sorcerer or a sort of great wizard. And he had created this mouth of truth in which a woman who was accused of being unchaste would put her hand in it. And if she was guilty, it would cut off two of her fingers so that her shame would be, in fact, public and sort of publicly visible in this case. Um, we also see a lot of examples of espionage and surveillance. We see also attached to the history of Alexander this idea of using farcasting. In this case, Nectanebus, who is Alexander's biological father, uses farcasting, a magical technology with a wand and a kind of reflective surface to see something that's happening far away. So in this case, this is this idea of using AI as a way to augment human capabilities. And then the middle image is actually from an Anglo-Norman text from the middle of the 12th century, end of the 12th century, which is a spell or a charm to see what a friend is doing far away. So again, it's this idea that you can use a kind of technology to get access, to surveil, to see something that is happening a long way away. And then you also have this idea on the final image of this notion of the court as this highly policed and surveilled space. This image is from a version of the story of Troy from the 13th, sort of 12th, 13th century, in which the alabaster chamber, which is the sort of heart of the Trojan court, is policed and watched by these AIs, these different sort of golden enchanted figures that engage in attention capture. They monitor your dress, they monitor your speech, they monitor your thoughts and every aspect of your behavior. And they speak to this idea of the court as a particularly surveilled place. And then finally, and very briefly, we see them associated with prediction and foreknowledge, this idea of creating sort of magical oracular heads that can get access to the future. And so that leads me to conclude with my final provocation, which is that AI is not revolutionary. So when we consider this long history of AI, we actually see that it's used in the service of power in the context of absolutism and in societies that rely on slave labor and on servant classes, and that it's used to maintain gender and class divisions, that it's used for political and military dominance, and to acquire knowledge that can confer an advantage. And so I'll just leave us with this idea that no technology can be revolutionary if it serves and further entrenches the existing social order. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Ellie and Jacqueline and Kevin, for this. It is my privilege to start with questions, and I have many for my guests. But this is also the cue for our audience members to start putting questions into the Q&A box, and I will fold them into our conversation. So one theme that I felt was really cutting across all of these terrific accounts, and I really mean that I took copious notes, is the idea of uncertainty, but for the purpose of sustaining power, position, certain epistemologies. So not necessarily uncertainty as something that is a problem that we sort of then almost altruistically develop a technology or a solution for that serves the common good, but something that's sort of produced and held there and then sort of addressed through innovation, through technology. It's almost something, that is quasi-divine. Jacqueline, you spoke about that, right? Kevin, you spoke about how intelligence is social, right? But we are now thinking about it individualistically, or we have this sort of narrow definition. And Ellie, you just landed at the sort of absolutism. So can you all speak about the idea of uncertainty vis-a-vis your provocations? Does that make sense? Is it an instrument? Where does it sit? Does it sit anywhere? Because it seems that today when we speak and talk about AI, it is to sort of solve the uncertainty problem, right? So we can better predict. We can better predict the risk of somebody defaulting on their loan, the risk of a flood, the risk of our students not completing their degrees. This is, dealing with uncertainty. Jacqueline, maybe you have thoughts on this.
No, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, my first instinct is to say, and to touch back to Ellie's presentation. So Ellie emphasized that in the Hellenistic period, we actually have some material and literary evidence that these sort of royal courts in Alexandria and elsewhere are sort of commissioning these spectacles, these automata that move, that are process. Sometimes they're sort of representations of like heroic figures or even the divine. And the joy, the marvel of them is that you don't know how they work, right? The spectator, that there is a master craftsman. And I saw in the comment an important emphasis that techne does not mean technology, it means art or craft, right? That there is some master artifice behind them. But the whole purpose or the whole joy of the spectacle is not knowing how they operate. And you see such delight and a lot of post-classical Greek and Latin literature as the Hellenistic empires are growing in wealth and power, and with the rise of the Roman Empire, an outgrowth of a spectacle culture in which the whole point is to come to the urban center and see these things being performed and to be dazzled by the not knowing, the uncertainty of how it's moving, how is it operating. So I think uncertainty can often be an item of dread, but at least from the ancient world, the curiosity, the fascination, the delight, and the continuation of these production of these artificial spectacles is precisely the curiosity and delight of not knowing, of the uncertainty.
Thank you. Kevin, do you want to add to the delight of the spectacle, of being dazzled? And of course, I'm thinking about the black box, right? The mathy math.
Yeah, no, the scientific revolution took care of all of that, and kind of removed that level of delight. I mean, that's certainly what I was thinking from my perspective when you mentioned uncertainty, is just the degree to which scientists and social scientists and the sciences of man were so determined to remove all forms of uncertainty because of how they thought that it had misguided in the world of the medieval world, which of course, you have fortuna and you have fate and you have these kind of fascinating ideas that make life a little bit more interesting. And what you get obviously with Newton and the and the scientific revolution is this focus on certainty, even to the point where, Laplace has to remove the slightest bit of uncertainty in planetary movements because Newton left a little room for God to operate. And what you start to see is this development of intelligence become almost completely predictable and behavioristic. I mean, they wouldn't have used that term, but you have people like Helvetius and Holbach who are trying to explain that literally every thought or every action or every performance or anything that is done by a person can be traced back to some causal connection from literally the beginning of time, and that all human behavior is essentially just complex particle physics. And I think, that's kind of the AI that we have built. I mean, there's other ways that you could have built AI, but that's very much the AI that we've built. And that's one of the reasons why I don't think it would make any sense or would have any meaning for people in the Middle Ages or Antiquity, because those very forms of thinking, those very ways of being, would, I think, be somewhat antithetical. I don't know if I am historicizing too much and making too much of a break between the past. Maybe it's a later question, but I wonder about the just the simple nature of what intelligence would have meant to someone in say Antiquity. I'm just thinking. Something like the Turing test. No one ever talks about what the human interlocutors would be like in the Turing test. What if you took Pericles or Alexander and they were the person who was doing the interviewing? Would it be a lot different or harder to tell them the difference between them and a computer? And so I don't know. Those are some later questions maybe that I'd like to get into. But certainly in the terms of modern artificial intelligence, the delights of uncertainty, as Jacqueline mentioned, are kind of no more.
Yeah, no more completely into the different direction or not, right? So Ellie, I actually have a different, I'm gonna sort of build on this and have a slightly different question for you, if you don't mind. So you spoke about the ritualized spaces and these automata and the spectacle being sort of embedded into sort of rituals and ritualized spaces. And so vis-a-vis the conversation that we are having, for example, in education and pedagogy, around generative AI and learning and all of that, and the um, embedding of AI systems into our very intimate lives, are we bringing ritualized spaces back into our homes because we are bringing AI into our very intimate lives, which would be, a sort of a return to uh, to ritual and to away from the sort of science that Kevin is describing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference is that kind of we have a very different notion about kind of public from private, versus, people who lived in the past. And I think also one of the things that is kind of important to kind of think about is that we actually have access to being alone. And actually, in the past, I mean, that's one of the things like the elites you were constantly watched. You were never alone. You always had your slaves around you. You always had servants in earshot. If you were a ruler, you lived essentially publicly in to a large extent. And I think that that too is one of the things that I think really comes out then in a lot of these examples from the medieval period is that they speak to that, this idea of constantly being watched or on display, and the concerns around, I mean, especially in the consequences for not behaving appropriately or saying the wrong thing could be devastating. And I think something like the figures in Troy, right, in this kind of the history of Troy, speak to this sense of it would be like that they reflect both a reality, which is that people at court felt scrutinized, right? They were always under scrutiny, and also a fantasy of what if you had figures that knew all the rules, all the unspoken rules, and could kind of tell you secretly how to behave. So it would kind of reduce your anxiety. And in fact, the text says that people who know how to behave and the right way to act, like they have less anxiety, right? And they can more easily enjoy themselves or kind of take part in public life. So I think that is a sort of sense of just a different set of kind of understanding of like ritualized spaces. I think now one of the issues around something like AI in the classroom is that it is a very that being watched that aspect to education, and I'm sure Jacqueline can like speak to this more, but when you are teaching in person, you are you are watching your students and you are watching them watch you. And if you are a student, you are watching your instructor and you're watching your instructor watch you. Like it goes, and that is something that isn't necessarily ritualized, but it actually seems that AI kind of interrupts that kind of recursive gaze in that is actually really pedagogically productive. It seems like AI interferes in that in a way that that actually kind of breaks that space and fractures it in a way that is different. It's sort of seen as different from in the past.
Thank you so much, Ellie. Jacqueline, I'm so curious to hear you respond to this.
No, I was gonna add something myself unprompted that I think that's precisely right. I mean, the very last anecdote I shared about this Sabinus guy who buys all these slaves, who each one of them has memorized some segment of the canon. I mean, Seneca is telling this story in a very critical way, right? We should not be like Sabinus. He's a bad example. But the point that Seneca's trying to make is that this new money guy has totally misunderstood the point of education, right? And in a way that I think is really relevant to the present day, because this rich Sabinus, he thinks that what education is just the content, right? If you have the content quick at hand, if you can quickly spout off a Homeric line or some verse from Pindar, then you have education. But for Seneca, and Seneca is himself an educator and a moral philosopher, he knows precisely what Ellie is talking about. Like, there's a difference between knowledge and paideia, which is the cultivation of a really rich command of the tradition, but also in the sort of social settings where you do know what verse to cite to comfort a friend. And again, yes, of course, we're talking about very elite, very male constructed spaces, right? But for Seneca, as for Plato, just having the knowledge at your fingertips is a complete failure. It's the robust command of the tradition that you can only get by reading, by internalizing, and exchanging in that sort of intellectual camaraderie. And I'll put my cards on the table. That is also my great concern about AI, right? Yes, we have all these math equations at our fingertips, but have you actually done the deep learning that produces that knowledge that can be applied and shared in productive ways socially?
And I just want to say too, just to like piggyback onto what Jacqueline was saying, is that in that example, right, if you're just kind of picking your little tag from like Horace or whatever to kind of say you're basically a parrot, right? You're a machine, right? You kind of so it's this idea that actually you're I mean, you're saying the words, but there's no intelligence behind it. There's nothing human behind it, which I think gets to Kevin's point about what is the human level.
Kevin, what is the human level here? And also, well, because that's one question, and then sort of I'm going to add to that the following one. We are talking a lot about the use of predictive systems of machine learning of AI in the production of scientific knowledge today, right? And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, thank you. I was gonna just jump in with Ellie's example. I mean, it's very. I mean, John Searle just passed away, and of course the Chinese room experiment of do you really know anything if you're just manipulating symbols in a foreign language and handing them back? It's just thought of it with his passing, just recently. And just one thing on the education aspect, one of the things that the prophets of the past were trying to do and try or were most worried about is that they weren't worried about machines that would become as smart as people. They were worried that the education system was reducing people to such a mechanical level that they were themselves were becoming machines. And I think that's probably true. If there's probably a lot of professors in the audience or in the chat who have obviously had that experience of wondering if it's an AI paper or just a very kind of dull student who learned the 5 paragraph essay and hasn't been able to move beyond that. And I'm thinking of the New York Magazine piece. Apologize for my language, but is it AI or does it just suck? Which kind of said that it's very difficult to tell the difference sometimes between things that are AI generated and things that are most mundane and sort of tedious because they kind of overlap so much. So I did think of that when you asked the question about sort of the removal of delights from the world. So I did want to get that in, and I think while I was giving that answer, I may not have answered your direct question, Mona. So if I didn't, if you could ask it again, or if I did,
Yes, absolutely. So I was interested in, well, speaking of machines and tools, right? So tools can be useful, right? In the product, in with we can do things with tools, including in the production of knowledge, and we've all been doing that. I mean, we're doing this right now, right? We're using a tool to have a conversation, produce new knowledge. So, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the sort of the removal of the human in the production of knowledge or in sort of um, creating meaning in thinking vis-a-vis the production of scientific knowledge, where tools have always been extremely important and where machine learning now is extremely important, right? You can't open a nature, you can't open nature without there being at least half of the, if not all of the articles having used machine learning as their predominant method, using machine learning as a tool for the production of scientific knowledge.
yeah, thank you for and I appreciate the question because if you do kind of go further back, you do find the almost right around the time of the scientific revolution, you get the kind of gentleman of science vision of the person who is kind of free of any intellectual or any financial constraints, and then are just sort of free to pursue their tasks. One of the things though those people were also always asking for, however, was more resources, more tools. If you go back to people like Charles Babbage, constantly demanding more and more money and more tools. So certainly from the production of scientific knowledge, I don't think that it would be very different from other tools itself. I think the argument that someone like Bonald or some of these prophets from the past might argue is that very sort of desire for scientific knowledge or that very pursuit itself is itself misguided. So that the use of the resources for AI for scientific knowledge is for them just as much of a waste of the British government putting money into the calculating engine of Charles Babbage that it essentially doesn't further human interests. And so, I mean, that would be I'm kind of copying out a little bit because I'm giving their opinion rather than my own. But as someone who doesn't do active scientific research, and someone who has sort of studied science in the past, I think people like Latour, and people who kind of study scientists in action, would say that this is very little is different about this than what has gone before, and that these tools are essentially being used in the way that engineers and scientists have always used them.
Yeah, so a very, very clear continuation. That is a cue for our wonderful audience members to continue bringing in questions. And I'm going to start, and Ali, I'm going to start with you. And this is a perfect, Kevin gave a perfect cue for this question. So James Sherry is asking, are our questions weakened in relevance due to prior automation?
Sorry, would you say that one more time?
Um, so I'm going to get the whole question. Has this idea of disappearance of the human already largely taken control over our lives, with the use of computers and industrial automation, are our questions weakened in relevance due to prior automation, right? Like, why are we worried? In other words, right?
So I think it's never too late or to, I mean, ask old questions in new ways or, return to questions that you thought were settled. What I think is different about this moment, um, I think, yeah, AI is a tool, machine learning is a tool. Um, as a historian of technology, I'll say that, societies historically they adopt technologies or not based on their own needs. What's different now is that there's a group of extremely powerful billionaires who control this technology, who are insistent on inserting it and requiring its uptake. And that is different. And that I think is where that kind of points to this question of whose interest does the adoption of this technology serve? Whose interest does this technology serve? And that, that ends up ultimately to me actually looking like a lot like the past and not like a kind of liberatory, revolutionary future.
Thank you, Ali. Jacqueline, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a tremendous amount to add to what Ellie said, except that, and this also relates to another great question in the chat, which is that um, when I think about ancient paradigms of liberation or like a sort of ideal society, the myths that come to mind to me are about peoples who are largely devoid of technological apparatus. Like the ancient Hyperboreans were these mythical people who lived to the far north, and their fruits grew themselves, and they didn't. I mean, it was a site that was like totally devoid of labor. Same thing with the Phaeacians, the sort of mythical peoples in the Odyssey who are blessed by Poseidon and therefore don't really need to do and invest in sort of technological. I mean, they are master ship builders, right? That is their techne, that's their craft. Um, but I would agree. I can't think of any paradigm quite like the sort of modern billionaire driven infiltration of the artificial into our world. But it I mean, I think someone like an Elon Musk or any of these, Mark Zuckerberg would fit quite well into like ancient Alexandria or the Salute of the Roman world, right? In that they are often projecting technological mastery as a performative display and inculcation of their power. Yeah.
And we're dazzled again, right? Um, so what are so
Could I just add
what's
one quick, could I add one quick thing on that?
absolutely,
No,
Kevin?
no, I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think Ellie said a lot if you're just sort of reading the newspaper about what's different and what matters. And I think, the production of data centers and everything that people like Kate Crawford have chronicled. And I also say from a historical perspective, it's kind of the elimination of difference. There has been, there's this vision that the kind of modern 20th century, or modern Western version of intelligence might kind of pass into history and that something else might replace it, like other versions of intelligence have. But we're kind of embedding a very particular form of thinking and manner of thinking that has only existed in one part of the world for the last couple hundred years, and we're basically making that synonymous with what it means to be human. And if you add it to the financial ramifications, it kind of has a way of ending history in a very different way, which is that there is no sort of next step or next stage, and that we kind of get the modern Western vision of what it means to be a person or to be an intelligent person, kind of embedded for all time into our computer systems. And I think that's probably, for me at least, as a historian, the greatest danger is the inability to evolve or move on or have difference, because it all kind of gets narrowed down into one specific vision. So I had to add that. Sorry.
But isn't there precedent of that um not being successful in the past, or at least ending in crisis, war, or very badly?
Yeah, I mean, if that's the good version, is that this whole thing collapses into spectacular war. I mean, I guess it could end in that way, but that would probably be bad in its own manner. I was just thinking of I use it in the book in the conclusion, but I was thinking of Foucault's kind of description of Western man, and okay, it's a thing and it's an idea, and the Enlightenment version of what a person is had its time and will pass, and we'll have a new version of what a person is. But we're kind of embedding that very Enlightenment version of what a person is and does and thinks. And so, yes, we could have a kind of return to the deep, deep, deep prehistorical past that might reset that, but that would kind of be its own problem.
Yeah,
Can
and we're
I
yeah,
can I just jump in too and say that it's also interesting to then think about who in this paradigm is like who is the person or who is fully human. Because if you look at so in from what I'm where I stand and sort of the kinds of examples that I'm looking at, and to get back to this first question of yours, Mona, about certainty, a lot of the sort of fantasies of AI is that they act as completely, they are servants that you can be certain about, right? That you do not have to worry about them falling asleep, getting drunk. You don't have to worry about them being bribed. You don't have to worry about them getting sick, having any kinds of needs, right? That, or, betraying you. And so there is this sense in which, in some aspects, then the servant or the AI is seen as like you don't want them to be human, right? Because they need things or because they're complicated or they're unpredictable, and also they might be venal and greedy, etc. Um, and so in that case, there is a kind of definition of who is human, but without actually, where actually humanity is the problem that has to be solved.
which is so interesting when you think about how human machine collaboration is so quickly evolving, often in this sort of problem space or with this frame, right? So, all right, we have 2 more minutes to go. So I'm going to ask one super quick question, and this is for all of you because before we're gonna wrap. What are forms of resistance that you've seen in your work and that you can think of how they can be applied in our current? And I'm gonna add not just resistance, but forms of progress, of innovation, of growth, of development. So resistance and moving forward. And we're gonna go Jacqueline, Kevin, Ellie, and then we're gonna wrap.
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind to me when it comes to resistance is actually just the critical role, and it never vanishes, of philosophy in ancient intellectual discourse. I mean, because one of the core questions that Plato is just obsessed with is what is techne? What is craft? What counts as craft knowledge? Who has it? Who passes it on? And you might think that given just the voluminousness of Plato and the fact that this is like that he, is still read well, well into the medieval period, that he answers the question, but he doesn't actually. I mean, we can see well into the Hellenistic period is the knowledge of grammar, is the knowledge of mathematics a techne. And it's a vigorous and vibrant debate that can like what do we mean by intelligence, and of course obsession with specious forms of intelligence and craft knowledge, right? Like how can we actually detect a truly cultivated wisdom versus its sort of imitators, and what makes it distinctive. So I don't know, maybe this is a little trite, but just the practice of philosophical discourse and intellectual contestation is itself perhaps the most important method of interrogating and innovating as the ancient world is increasingly becoming surrounded by techne.
Sorry. I would maybe offer, well, just because we're talking about education, I would first, I don't have one, I do have one handy here. A blue book, I think, is a great thing to do. And if you're talking about sort of ancient forms going back, one of the things that I think a lot of education is going back to is maybe not the Socratic dialogue, but at least in-person kind of formal exams. I am a big fan of the Situationists. I'm a big fan of Dadaism. I'm a big fan of art, which is seems to be the least um, capable of being captured by these. So I think following a lot of the tenets of the Situationists and Dadaists can help you at sort of an individual level. And then collectively, it's a little cliche, but I teach, kind of civics. And I think voting matters a lot. And I think who we elect at the local level when it comes to things like data centers, I think it matters at the larger level. I mean, I think prior to the past couple of years, there might have actually been some sort of bipartisan overlap that was getting fed up with the tech world. I know that's kind of shifted recently, but I think that there is some effort on many politicians' part to try to claw back some of this. And so I think just public participation in the voting and activist process can be the most helpful at the general level. And just be a random person also helps a lot.
Um, I don't find really a lot of instances of resistance in the texts and things that I study because they were made by elites for elites, and so they are about elite concerns. But I do think that you constantly see in these, especially in these kind of fantastical sort of stories about it, you see like what Kevin is talking about, this idea that art, that human art, by which is meant both kind of aesthetic, beauty, like creation in, poetry and visual arts, but also the idea of human making is the thing that is that ends up being the sort of like powerful and subversive in kind of interesting ways. But that often what you do see are stories of hubris, of people reaching for knowledge that is not theirs to have, reaching for certainty, wanting certainty that is not available to humans. And in their efforts to get it, they overreach themselves and they either end up kind of, misunderstanding a prophecy or something that the AI says to them, and then they, like die, or they sleep through the moment of revelation because they're human and they need sleep. So I think those are the kinds of stories that they also are clearly kind of interested in and that I kind of point to.
Thank you so much. And I think in there is sort of the message we are and remain humans, right? And we are and remain humans in relation to one another and tell each other stories about our humanness, sometimes through technology. A massive, massive thanks to Jacqueline Arthur-Montagne, Kevin Donnelly, and Ali Truitt for this terrific and truly timeless conversation today. Much, much gratitude. These are public scholars. You can read their work everywhere they are around. Please do. I think we can all say we learned a thing or two today. We are closing out Co-opting AI for the year next month with a conversation on libraries on November 19th, 4 p.m. with Shanti Byrne-Simpson, Eric Kleinenberg, and Peter Musser. We'll be talking about the place of libraries in our social lives. We'll be talking about public infrastructure and we'll talk about knowledge. So please join us again. Again, thank you so much, Jacqueline, Kevin, and Ellie for joining. Thank you to our team in the background for making this possible. And thank you, wonderful audience, for returning to the Co-opting AI space. Thank you so much and see you next month.